Lori and Larry met when they both had a few failed marriages and several children behind them, but they were able to bring a wonderful feeling over the years. On the morning of February 13th, before Valentine's Day, they had a romantic date which cost one of them his life. Larry and Lori Eisenberg had just returned from Idaho, where the man crossed a few items off his wish list. He wanted to watch the launch of the shuttle, ride a fan boat, and learn to sail. On the cold morning of February 13th, 2018, Larry, 68, and his wife, Lori, 64, woke up early to watch the sunrise. They took their motorboat out into the calm waters of Lake Dahlen, Idaho, to enjoy the first rays of sun at a picturesque place called Sam Bay before driving to an exclusive resort for breakfast. Unfortunately, these wishes could not come true. Just a few hours later, at 10:25 a.m., the Costanai County Sheriff's Office received an alarm call. The woman's voice burst into a scream. She choked from sobbing, but when she calmed down a bit, she was able to explain to the emergency dispatcher what had happened. Larry and Lori Eisenberg had been together for 17 years. Each of them had several children from previous relationships, but despite this, they never argued and always looked for a reason to praise each other. Relatives and friends spoke of them as a wonderful couple who could carry their love through the years. On the eve of Valentine's Day, the man was in a romantic mood. He considered every day to be the best of his life. He always appeared everywhere with a smile on his face. That morning, Larry sent his daughter a photo of the sunrise before leaving and wrote to a friend that the fishing trip was canceled because he was feeling a little unwell. The Eisenberg couple boarded the boat. Larry started the engine, and the boat carried them, gently rocking on the water towards the sun. They were already quite far from the shore when the engine suddenly stopped. The man went to the bow of the ship to see what had happened to the engine. Suddenly, Larry became dizzy and fell overboard into the ice-cold water. Lori, who had not expected something like this, got in agitation and rushed to help him, but she stumbled, fell, and hit her head on the heater. Blood started to flow from her nose. When she stood up, her husband was nowhere to be found. Apparently, he disappeared in the dark water. Attempts to find the cell phone were unsuccessful. Then Lori tried to start the engine, but when Larry fell, he apparently broke the ignition switch and had to start the engine manually. The desperate woman circled the spot where her husband had fallen into the water. As she looked into the mirror surface of the lake and desperately tried to find him, she was afraid to swim any further or to return to the shore so as not to lose her bearings. She even pressed the boat horn several times to get someone's attention. When Lori realized that everything was useless, she only felt that her whole body was cold. She took out the blanket and saw her husband's cell phone. When she called the emergency services, about 2 hours had already passed since Larry disappeared in the ice-cold water. After the call, Lori hopelessly dropped her hand, and the phone slipped overboard. Shortly after 11 o'clock, the officers arrived at the nearby shore and sent a rescue boat to bring the distraught woman ashore and provide medical care while the Eisenbergs' boat was towed for further investigation. Although at first glance everything looked like a tragic accident, the police had to make sure that there was no evidence of a crime. Larry was probably dead after more than 2 hours in the water. Survival under such harsh conditions is almost impossible. Now it was a matter of reproducing a detailed picture of the incident and checking the veracity of the woman's words. When boarding the boat, the investigators immediately noticed blood spatter in several places, presumably due to the woman's nosebleed. Although Lori stated that the ignition switch was defective shortly before Larry went under the water, the police found a switch and the cord on the floor. The investigators found it strange because in order for the engine to start, the switch and belt must be attached to the ignition lock. In addition, the ignition key was clearly bent, which indicated a possible struggle. They also searched Lori's bags. In her handbags, there were several keys and an empty juice bottle. All items were confiscated as evidence, and the boat was taken to a nearby parking lot for storage. The truck that the Eisenbergs used to tow the boat was also inspected, but nothing special was found there. One of the officers noticed Lori's lost cell phone and a bottle of allergy medication on the center console. It was an over-the-counter medication. The search for Larry Eisenberg in the water was made more difficult by the fact that he was wearing dark clothing, and Lori did not know exactly where the boat was when the man fell overboard. This significantly expanded the search area. Instead of a rescue diver, they decided to use an acoustic group. Search and rescue helicopters also flew over the lake in the hope of finding the body of the drowned man, but without success. On the first day, the sonar rescue team spent 3.5 hours searching for Larry in the cold water. Experts searched for the body in the lake until it became too dark to see anything. Meanwhile, one of the officers met with Lori Eisenberg at the hospital where the woman was taken after the incident. He wanted to determine a more precise search area, so he showed her a map of the lake and asked her to tell him again how Larry had fallen into the water and what exactly had happened to the boat's engine. Lori said that after a walk along the lake, she started to say something about the resort they were going to. Originally, he had planned to go fishing in the morning, but in the morning his health deteriorated, so they just decided to enjoy the morning and have breakfast at the resort. At that moment, the engine stopped, and Larry went to see what the problem was. Lori herself stayed inside and watched through the glass what her husband was doing. Suddenly, he turned around, turned pale, and began to fall on his side. Apparently, at the moment of the fall, he leaned on the key and it bent in the ignition. The woman thought that there was something wrong with his heart and rushed to his aid. If she hadn't tripped at the worst possible moment, Larry might still have been there. Lori covered her face with her hands and was silent for a while. Only her shoulders were shaking with silent sobs. A few minutes later, she ran her finger over the map but could not determine the exact location of the tragedy. Her thoughts were confused, and she could not remember whether there were trees or houses nearby or which side the sun was shining from. She even lost track of time as she searched for her husband in the water. In such situations, a minute can seem like an eternity. Due to the great depth of the lake and the low water temperature, the search for the body was very difficult. First, the sonar team had to find the drowned person and then, with the help of rescue divers, raise the body to the surface. Since efforts to find Larry were still unsuccessful, investigators called Lori on February 18th, 5 days after the tragedy, and asked her to accompany the sonar team to the lake. But the woman's presence was just a nuisance. She still could not remember any specific landmarks. The lack of any information about the whereabouts seemed strange to the investigators, but Eisenberg's behavior surprised them even more during the search. Lori joked, laughed irrelevantly, and then suddenly started to sob as if she remembered why she was invited to the lake. After the death of a loved one, too little time had passed, and Lori obviously could not come to terms with the idea that her husband was no longer alive and now felt guilty for having shown positive feelings. Our paradise, that is what Larry Eisenberg called his home. After the death of her husband, Lori could no longer stay in the house where she had lived happily for 17 years. When the woman returned from the lake that day, she began to actively pack. Larry and Lori's residence was 20 minutes southwest of the city. The woman invited her relatives to help move all the things and furniture out of the house because she wanted to sell it as quickly as possible. Vigilant neighbors reported this to the police. It seemed to them that the woman was behaving strangely and suspiciously. Before we continue with the rest of the story, I would like to remind you that if you are not subscribed to the channel yet, please subscribe now and like the video so that I have the energy to publish new videos. Thank you. Lori Eisenberg was proud to have worked for the North Idaho Housing Coalition for many years, and just recently, the chief accountant of this institution ordered an internal audit because he noticed several violations. Many employees suspected that something illegal was going on in the coalition, but when the truth came to light, all employees were literally stunned. This shocking revelation aroused the interest of the investigators and gave the investigation a completely new direction. Lori Eisenberg was suspected of possible fraudulent activity. It was about the theft of coalition funds amounting to $500,000. The woman was suspended and threatened with dismissal. Everyone who knew her could not believe what was happening. Lori had no criminal records. She and her husband were not poor. All these accusations seemed to be some kind of monstrous mistake. As the children sensed that something was wrong, they asked for permission to speak to the investigators about their concerns. They expressed concerns about going to the lake at this time of year. Also, their father did not go fishing because he was not feeling well. Then Dean spoke to Larry's son about Lori's strange behavior in the last few days after their father disappeared. She asked how they would divide the inheritance. He was very worried about his father's death, so he just left without even talking about this topic. It seemed premature to him, as his father's body had still not been found. In order to somehow reassure the relatives of the deceased, the detective explained how the search was carried out. The sonar group first checked the area of highest probability, but if this did not produce any results, they scanned the water diagonally in different directions. After Larry's family had left, the investigators discussed all the details of the case again. And although Eisenberg's wife was not one of the suspects, her behavior in general raised doubts. She was able to calmly answer all the investigators' questions and explain all the details, but something about the investigation kept the investigators busy. The next day, a search was carried out in the Eisenberg house in connection with Lori's fraud allegations, and on February 27th, the woman was arrested on 40 counts of forgery and grand theft at the nonprofit North Idaho Housing Coalition, where she had previously worked as executive director. Her bail was set at $75,000, which was immediately posted by one of her daughters. But the shocking discovery happened literally a day later. On March 1, 2018, 2 weeks after Larry Eisenberg suddenly fell from his boat into the icy waters of Lake Kootenai, the body of a man was found floating face down near the shore about 5 kilometers from the accident site stated by his wife. No suspicious injuries were found on the body, and based on the drowned man's clothing, it was likely that the search had ultimately been successful. The body was pulled from the water and sent for further examination. An autopsy confirmed that it was Larry Eisenberg, but the coroner also found the cause of death. It turns out Larry did not die in the water, as no signs of drowning were found. Toxicology tests found lethal levels of an antihistamine in his body, which is used to combat allergies and suppress some cold symptoms. This medicine works very quickly but can only be fatal in rare cases if too much is taken in a short period of time. Larry's antihistamine levels exceeded the norm by 70 times. Therefore, according to the coroner, Eisenberg died before he fell into the water. Authorities decided not to publish the autopsy results immediately. In an earlier statement to police, Lori mentioned that her husband took a number of different pills every day, then forgot about them and started taking them again, often mixing up the dosages. It is possible that the woman was telling the absolute truth, but it is also possible that she gave this information in advance in case the body was found and a lethal dose of drugs was discovered in the body. Lori also insisted that Larry had not been completely healthy recently and had complained of malaise, but all other relatives unanimously assured the opposite. The only time Eisenberg mentioned his illness was in a text message to a friend the morning before his disappearance. Presumably, he sent the text message himself. An experienced analyst determined that Larry's phone was last used near Lori's son's house, and that was after Eisenberg's disappearance. Although the woman claimed she threw the cell phone into the water immediately after calling the emergency services, Lori could not explain how the phone could have been used after that. Her son from a previous marriage also swore that he never held Larry's cell phone in his hand. In late May, Lori did not show up for a hearing in the fraud case. As it turned out, the woman was trying to avoid punishment. Eisenberg quickly fled the area and was on the run for about 2 months before surrendering to authorities in July. Detectives working on the case of Larry Eisenberg's mysterious death at the time interviewed colleagues and acquaintances of the deceased. They learned that the couple's ideal relationship was beginning to show cracks. Although Lori and Larry appeared to be a happy couple, the man had often complained to his friends in recent months about his wife's excessive spending. He did not like that a large portion of their joint savings went to support Lori's children, who were long since independent adults. Investigators also learned that Lori was a rather frivolous woman. She easily cheated on her first husband with 3 different men, including Eisenberg, and although this was in the past, it still did not provide a particularly flattering description of Larry's wife. The topic of betrayal was also raised on the board of the Housing Coalition, but the next discovery could serve as a concrete motive for the crime. Investigators discovered changes to Larry's will that had been made by none other than Lori. The handwritten changes were made about a month before his death. According to the new will, it turned out that 80% of the inheritance went not to his own children, but to 6 stepdaughters, Lori Eisenberg's daughters from another marriage. It is not known what the woman was expecting when she made these changes. Finally, the authorities released the results of the autopsy and called this case a comprehensive investigation into a particularly serious crime in which one person lost their life. The investigators even spoke to a doctor who said that Larry was perfectly healthy for his age. He was never prescribed a drug that later proved fatal. Based on all the evidence collected, the police assumed that Lori had mixed an excessive dose of medication into the juice bottle. Larry drank the contents and fell overboard from the effects of the toxic drug, not far from the shore where he was found. Lori immediately used a trolling motor to get the boat away from the area before calling 911. Neither spouse appear to have life insurance, which is often a motive for such crimes. However, investigators learned that there was an agreement between the spouses that if one of them died, the other would become the owner of the joint property. Lori planned to use the money to pay off the housing loan. At the time of his death, little did Larry know that his wife was involved in fraud at her workplace and that she was doing all this to help her daughters financially. At least that's what she told her children. 2 months later, in July 2018, Lori was tired of hiding because she knew that sooner or later she would be found. Anyway, she would contact the sheriff's office herself. She said she was simply living with her family in California. In early 2019, Lori and her 4 daughters admitted to having committed fraud using electronic communications, and acquaintances pleaded guilty to the charges. Lori Eisenberg was sentenced to 5 years in prison, and her daughters received 3 years probation and several hours of community service, as well as a fine of more than $50,000. While Lori was in prison for fraud, the investigation into her husband's strange death continued. Investigators checked the search history on the woman's phone and found incriminating evidence. While Larry enjoyed their trip to Florida together, Lori studied depth maps and articles about drownings and boating accidents. Finally, in February 2020, while she was still in federal prison for fraud and embezzlement, Lori was charged with the intentional death of her husband, Larry Eisenberg. Lori, 67, appeared in court in May 2021 for the verdict. She denied until the end that the crime was planned and tried to portray everything as an accident. But the jury did not believe the woman, and Lori Eisenberg was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole only after 30 years. The daughters of a selfish woman are involved in the story of a man's death, and this will remain a mystery forever.